The night was supposed to be uneventful. Dr. Naomi Carter, head of the Federal Police Bureau, had just wrapped up a long day of meetings in Washington, D.C. She was on her way home, cruising down a quiet road, when flashing red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. With a sigh, she pulled over, already sensing where this was going. This wasn't her first encounter with overzealous cops who saw black skin before credentials. Two officers approached, white, young, cocky. Their badges read Stevens and Daniels. From the moment they stepped up to her car, their energy was wrong. No professionalism, no respect. "License and registration," Officer Stevens barked, his hand already hovering over his holster. Naomi kept her expression neutral as she reached for her purse. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" Daniels scoffed. "You can ask, but that don't mean you're gonna like the answer." She raised an eyebrow. "I'll take my chances." Stevens leaned in. "You were driving a little too nice through here." "People who obey the law that much are usually hiding something." Naomi blinked. "So I'm being stopped for following traffic laws?" "We asked the questions, lady." Daniels snapped his fingers. "License, now." Her grip on her purse tightened, but she didn't argue. She'd dealt with this kind of nonsense before. Men who let their badges turn into crowns, thinking authority gave them the right to treat people however they wanted. She handed over her ID and registration, watching closely as Stevens barely glanced at them before shoving them into his pocket. He didn't even read her name. "Step out of the vehicle." Her patience thinned. "Is there a reason for that?" Daniel's smirk vanished. "Because I said so." Naomi exhaled slowly, keeping her hands where they could see them. "Officers, you have no probable cause." "Lady, get out of the damn car!" Stevens yanked at the door handle. And just like that, she felt it, the shift. That fine line where a routine stop turns into something dangerous. She wasn't scared, she was furious. Naomi unclipped her seatbelt and stepped out, her eyes locking onto theirs. "I hope you both know exactly what you're doing." Stevens scoffed. "Yeah, and why's that?" She smiled, slow and knowing. "Because in about 5 minutes, this little mistake is going to cost you everything." Naomi knew exactly how this would play out the moment Stevens and Daniels approached her car. Still, she held her ground, keeping her voice steady and calm. "Officers, I've done nothing wrong. This is an unlawful stop, and you know it." Daniels scoffed, arms crossed like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You're being uncooperative. That's a problem." Naomi tilted her head. "Uncooperative? You're questioning our authority." Stevens stepped closer, close enough for her to smell the cheap coffee on his breath. "That's reason enough." Naomi's jaw clenched. "Questioning your authority isn't illegal. You need probable cause to detain me, and you don't have it." Daniels let out a low chuckle. "You hear that, Mark? We got ourselves a lawyer." Stevens grinned. "Yeah, too bad lawyers still have to follow orders." He placed his hand on his holster. "Step away from the vehicle. Now." Naomi's pulse remained steady. This wasn't her first time dealing with bullies in uniform. But something about these two told her they weren't just posturing. They were looking for a reason, any reason, to escalate. "I'm not resisting." She raised her hands slightly to show she wasn't a threat. "But I have a right to ask." "That's it." Stevens grabbed her arm. The grip was too tight, too aggressive, unnecessary. Naomi instinctively tensed, and that's all the excuse they needed. "Stop resisting," Daniel shouted. Loud enough for the dashcam to pick up, loud enough to justify whatever happened next. Before she could react, Stevens yanked her away from the car, twisting her arm behind her back. The pain was sharp, electric. Naomi gritted her teeth. "I said—" Daniel shoved her forward, and the cold metal of handcuffs clamped around her wrists. A few bystanders had gathered nearby, their phones raised, recording. One woman gasped. Someone else shouted, "Hey, she ain't even doing nothing!" Naomi could feel the heat of the cameras on her, but she kept her voice even. "You're making a serious mistake." Stephen scoffed. "Yeah, and why's that?" Naomi inhaled sharply, staring straight into the patrol car's side mirror, watching their smug faces reflect back at her. "Because when you figure out who I am, it'll be too late." The ride to the station was bumpy, on purpose. Stevens hit every pothole like he was trying to rattle her bones, glancing at her through the rearview mirror with that smug little smirk. Daniels, in the passenger seat, kept chuckling under his breath, like this was some inside joke only they were in on. Naomi sat perfectly still, hands cuffed behind her, eyes forward. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of flinching. When they pulled up to the precinct, Daniels yanked the door open and grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the car like she was a rag doll. "Let's go, superstar." Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they walked her toward processing. The room smelled like stale coffee and bad decisions. A few officers glanced up from their desks, bored. Another black woman in cuffs. Nothing new. Stevens dragged her to the fingerprint station, pressing her fingers against the scanner with unnecessary force. "You know, you could have just done what we said, and none of this would have happened." Naomi arched a brow. "You mean obeyed unlawful commands?" Daniel scoffed. "Oh, here we go. Another one of you know-it-alls." He turned to Stevens. "Bet she's one of those defund the police types." Naomi let out a slow breath, refusing to take the bait. Not yet. They led her down a hallway, stopping in front of the holding cells. The walls were concrete, the benches hard and unforgiving. A few other women sat inside, some sleeping, others staring blankly at the wall. "In you go." Stevens unlocked the door and shoved her inside. "Make yourself comfortable." Naomi turned slowly, her voice like steel. "I want my phone call." Daniels grinned. "Yeah? And I want to retire in the Bahamas. Looks like neither of us are getting what we want tonight." The door slammed shut. Naomi sat down on the bench, flexing her sore wrists, rolling her shoulders to work out the tension. This was temporary. She glanced toward the front desk, where an older officer, mid-50s, graying at the temples, was watching her with narrowed eyes. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't amusement or indifference. It was something else. Recognition. His gaze flicked to the computer screen in front of him, then back to Naomi. And just like that, she knew. He figured it out. Naomi didn't waste a second. The moment the desk sergeant handed her the phone, she dialed a number she knew by heart. "Department of Justice, this is Special Agent Roberts." Naomi's voice was steady, clipped, professional. "This is Dr. Naomi Carter, Federal Police Director. I need immediate intervention. I've been unlawfully detained." The entire room shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A coffee cup nearly slipped out of an officer's hand. The sergeant behind the desk went stiff. Even Stevens and Daniels, who had been chuckling in the corner, suddenly stopped breathing. "Ma'am," Agent Roberts sounded thrown. "Can you confirm location?" Naomi's eyes flicked up, meeting the sergeant's now pale face. "I'm at the 12th precinct, and I'd like to know why." The sergeant was already typing furiously. His expression shifted from confusion to panic as her file loaded onto the screen. His jaw clenched. Stevens, standing a few feet away, finally found his voice. "What kind of bullshit is this?" He laughed, but it was forced, his face losing color. "You ain't no—" The sergeant cut him off, voice sharp. "Shut up!" Stevens blinked. "Excuse me?" The sergeant's eyes stayed locked on the screen. "You dumb son of a bitch!" Naomi didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just watched as the weight of reality crashed down on them. Daniel stepped closer, peering over the sergeant's shoulder. Whatever he saw made his face twist in horror. Dr. Naomi Carter, Federal Police Director. Not a lawyer, not a city official, not even a judge. One of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the damn country. Silence stretched. Naomi set the phone down, crossing her arms as she leaned against the desk. "Well?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Someone going to explain to me why I was thrown into a holding cell like a common criminal?" The sergeant swallowed hard. "Ma'am." "Save it." She turned her gaze to Stevens and Daniels. "I'd rather hear from them." Stevens took a half-step back. Daniels' hands twitched. They were already screwed, but they hadn't even begun to realize how bad it was going to get. The walk to the chief's office felt like a funeral march. Stevens and Daniels had been in tight spots before. Complaints here and there, minor disciplinary actions, but nothing like this. The moment they stepped inside, the air was suffocating. The blinds were shut. The overhead light cast long shadows, and Chief Howard sat behind his desk, staring at them like they were already corpses. "Sit!" His voice was ice. Neither of them moved. "I said sit." They dropped into the chairs across from him, exchanging a glance, searching for some kind of lifeline. There wasn't one. Chief Howard exhaled slowly, then hit a button on his laptop. The body cam footage played on the mounted screen behind him. Every word, every shove, every unnecessary order. the forceful handcuffing, the way they ignored Naomi's calm warnings. And finally, her words. "You're making a serious mistake." The video stopped. The silence stretched. The chief leaned forward. His fingers were laced together, his knuckles white. "Tell me you dumbasses didn't just arrest the federal police director." Daniels swallowed. Stevens tried to keep his posture straight. "Chief, we—" "Shut up!" It was barely above a whisper, but it made them both flinch. Howard opened a file on his desk and slid it toward them. It was Naomi Carter's full profile. Photo, title, background. "Read." Stevens's face drained of color as his eyes scanned the page. Daniels' lips parted slightly, as if struggling to breathe. "No," Daniels whispered, like maybe saying it out loud would change reality. "Yes." Howard's voice was deadpan. "You didn't just arrest some random woman. You didn't even just arrest a judge. You arrested the woman who oversees law enforcement at a national level. The one who has the power to wipe out your careers with a single call." Stevens's jaw clenched. "Chief, she didn't identify herself." Bullshit." Howard slammed his fist on the desk, making them both jump. "You didn't ask. And even if she hadn't said a word, none of that justifies what you two did. You profiled her, escalated for no reason, violated her rights, and now—" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Now you've put this entire department in the crosshairs of the Department of Justice." Daniels blinked rapidly, his throat bobbing. What happens now?" Howard let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough." The holding cell door swung open so fast it banged against the wall. Naomi Carter didn't even flinch. She had been sitting calmly, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She had seen men crack under pressure in interrogation rooms, had watched powerful figures crumble when confronted with their own corruption. But she wasn't the one breaking here. "Ma'am," the sergeant said stiffly, "you're free to go." She stayed seated. "I'll leave when I get an explanation." The sergeant's eyes flickered with discomfort. He stepped aside, and Chief Howard entered, his face red with barely contained rage. Not at her, but at the two officers who had just destroyed their own futures. "Director Carter, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize," Howard said, his voice tight. He gestured toward the two officers behind him. Stevens and Daniels looked like they'd just been hit by a freight train. The sergeant hesitated, then reached down and unclasped the cuffs from Naomi's wrists. She rubbed them slowly, the red marks a stark contrast against her dark skin. Stevens tried to meet her gaze, but when she raised an eyebrow, he looked away. Daniels just stared at the floor. "This is unacceptable," Howard continued, turning toward them. "You two have humiliated this department, violated the rights of a federal official, and made us a national embarrassment. So here's what's going to happen." Stevens swallowed hard. "Chief, shut the hell up!" The room froze. "You have two choices," Howard said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Option 1, you resign. Today. Right now. Walk out of here and hope to God no one ever recognizes your faces again." Daniels looked sick. Stevens clenched his fists. "Option 2, Naomi asked, tilting her head. Howard didn't even glance at her. "You stay, and I make sure you're fired in the most public, humiliating way possible. Your names will be in every newspaper, every news broadcast, every goddamn social media post in the country. You'll never wear a badge again. You'll never work in law enforcement again. Hell, you'll be lucky if you get hired as mall security." Daniels exhaled shakily, Stevens's mouth open, then shut. "Choose." Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Daniels finally choked out, "I'll resign." Stevens hesitated, eyes darting between Naomi and Howard, like he was trying to find a way out of this. There wasn't one. Finally, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Same." Howard gave a stiff nod. "Good, get out." As they turned to leave, Naomi spoke for the first time since her release. Not even an apology. They froze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The weight of her words pressed down on them harder than any yelling ever could. Stevens hesitated, then glanced at her. She raised her hand, cutting him off. "Don't bother, you're not sorry, you're just scared." Neither of them said another word as they walked out, their footsteps echoing through the station like a death march. The department was in full meltdown mode. Reporters were already camping outside, cameras rolling, microphones ready to catch every ounce of the fallout. The second, Officer Stevens, and Officer Daniels stepped out of the station. They were blinded by flashing lights and bombarded with questions. Officer Stevens, do you regret your actions? Daniels, were you aware you arrested the federal police director? Do you think your resignations are enough, or should criminal charges be pursued? They kept their heads down, their faces tight with humiliation. There was no point in answering. No way to talk their way out of this. They weren't just quitting their jobs. They were walking away from their entire identities. No more power trips, no more authority. Just two disgraced ex-cops caught in a storm of their own making. Inside the station, Naomi Carter stood tall, watching the chaos unfold through the window. Chief Howard let out a deep sigh beside her. "They got off easy," he muttered. Naomi turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "They really did." Howard rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll be honest with you. This is a nightmare for us, but it's a wake-up call we needed. I won't let this get buried. Training is going to change. Policies will change." Naomi nodded. "Make sure it does. Because next time, the person in that cell might not have my connections. And you and I both know what happens when no one's watching." Howard swallowed, unable to argue. As she turned to leave, the sergeant who had uncuffed her stepped forward awkwardly. "Ma'am, Naomi cut him off with a look. "I don't need apologies. I need accountability." With that, she walked out of the station, past the scrambling officers and nervous staff, stepping straight into the firestorm outside. The second she appeared, the reporters turned on her. "Director Carter, how do you feel about what happened? Do you think this is an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem?" Naomi took a breath, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows abuse of power to thrive. And that system is about to change." With that, she got into her car and drove off, leaving behind a department in disgrace and a nation watching closely. The backlash was instant. By the next morning, angry crowds filled the streets outside the police station, their voices cutting through the air like sirens. Protesters held signs that read, "No more racist cops," and "Reform now," while chanting Naomi Carter's name. The city, already on edge from past incidents, had reached its breaking point. The video of Naomi's arrest had gone viral overnight. Every news outlet, from local channels to national networks, dissected the footage. How Stevens and Daniels had manhandled a woman who had done nothing wrong. How they had ignored her rights, and worst of all, how they had done it with the confidence of men who had never faced consequences. That confidence shattered. As the protests grew, so did the pressure. The Department of Justice announced a full-scale investigation into the precinct. This wasn't just about Stevens and Daniels anymore. This was about all of them. Naomi Carter made sure of that. The DOJ didn't waste time. Investigators started digging through every complaint the department had ever tried to bury. And what they found? Disgusting. Years of racial profiling. Dozens of excessive force complaints, mostly against black and brown civilians. Arrest reports filled with resisting arrest charges that didn't add up. Even internal whistleblowers had tried to speak out, only to be silenced. Now, no one was being silenced. As names started surfacing, officers who thought they were untouchable found themselves in deep trouble. Some were placed on immediate leave. Others, the worst offenders, were quietly advised to resign before things got worse. But quitting wouldn't save them, not this time. With the world watching, the city had no choice but to act. The mayor held a press conference, struggling to keep control of the chaos. "We take these allegations very seriously. We are committed to justice and transparency." Too late. No one believed them. Not when this had been happening for years. Not when it took arresting one of the most powerful black women in the country for them to finally care. And Naomi, she wasn't done. She stood before the cameras, eyes burning with resolve, and spoke the words that no one could ignore. "This is not just about me. This is about every black man, every black woman, every person of color who has been harassed, humiliated, or hurt by a system that protects its own, instead of the people it swore to serve." The crowd erupted. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a reckoning. Naomi Carter didn't just walk away from this incident. She turned it into a movement. The same week, the investigation into the precinct expanded. She was already in meetings with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and federal officials. Her message was simple. This isn't just about two bad cops. It's about a system that allows them to exist. Within days, new policies were drafted. Mandatory racial bias training became a requirement for all officers. Not just a box to check off, but a real, hands-on program designed to retrain law enforcement on how to approach traffic stops, de-escalation, and community policing. Officers who refused, gone. But Naomi knew training wasn't enough. Accountability had to have teeth. She pushed for independent oversight boards in every major city, staffed by civilians, not cops policing cops. These boards would have the power to review body cam footage, investigate complaints, and even recommend firings for officers who abuse their power. And it didn't stop there. The Department of Justice, under intense public pressure, issued a nationwide directive reviewing police departments with high numbers of racial profiling complaints. Some precincts faced federal intervention. Others, like the one that arrested Naomi, were forced to overhaul their entire leadership. For the first time in years, real change was happening. Police unions fought back, of course. They called it an overcorrection, a war on cops. But the public wasn't buying it, not anymore. Because when Naomi Carter spoke, people listened. If a woman with my power and status can be treated like this, imagine what happens to the people without a badge, without a title, without a camera recording. Her words echoed across the country. Cities that had ignored racial profiling issues for years were now forced to act. New community-driven policing models were introduced. Routine traffic stops? They had new rules. Officers were required to provide a clear, documented reason for every stop. And body cam footage? Mandatory and publicly accessible if a civilian requested it. No more disappearing evidence. This wasn't just a policy shift. It was a new era. Naomi Carter didn't just walk away from this fight. She owned it. Her name became synonymous with reform. Her story, a case study in power and consequence. Law schools, police academies. Even Congress cited what happened to her as a turning point in how law enforcement should be held accountable. She didn't stop at policy changes. Naomi hit the streets, meeting with community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens who had been victims of police misconduct but never got the justice they deserved. She spoke at universities, town halls, and legislative sessions, making sure this moment wasn't forgotten. Power without accountability is just tyranny in uniform. That was her message, and people were listening. As for the officers, Mark Stevens and Rick Daniels couldn't escape their own disgrace. No police department would touch them, not after their names became national headlines. The video of their arrest went viral, played over and over in news reports, social media debates, and police training sessions labeled "What Not to Do." They tried applying for private security jobs, but even those companies didn't want the PR nightmare of hiring them. Rick Daniels ended up working night shifts at a warehouse. Mark Stevens? He disappeared from public view, a cautionary tale in a country that had finally run out of patience for cops like him. But Naomi? She thrived. Her work led to real consequences. Laws changed, police departments restructured, and oversight committees formed in cities that had resisted them for decades. And the best part? The next time a cop pulled someone over and thought about abusing their power, they hesitated. Because they knew people like Naomi Carter weren't just watching, they were waiting.